Before we get going, I'll try to do a really brief introduction, give you a little bit about us. Bozhidar and myself work at Pivotal, and we work on the SRE team that runs Pivotal Web Services. Pivotal Web Services is a publicly available hosted Cloud Foundry PaaS. We deploy it with Bosch, which is our VM orchestration framework. We automate much of our deploy process with Concourse CI, and we strive to apply test-driven development wherever we can in our tooling. We pair a lot. Pairing is a big part of Pivotal culture, and as part of that, we strive to provide our teammates with frequent and timely feedback, which is another big part of Pivotal's culture. Our team in particular is split between 4 different offices in 2 different time zones. We're 3 hours apart, so it's not too big of a split. And we use a lot of the usual remote work tools, Slack, Zoom, and VNC and Tmux for our pairing sessions. And come by and ask us about remote work. We love to talk about it. Without further ado, what we're really here to talk about is Toil, and we're going to present it to you in 3 acts, covering what it is, what we can do about it, and how we can help spread what we learn in our attempts to reduce our toil. Toil is probably something that most of us have a pretty good intuitive sense for, probably have a good sense of when the task you're doing now feels like toil. For us, some of the things that lead us to feel like we're doing toil might be whether the task we're doing right now has a pretty clearly defined end state or end criteria, whether the decision-making process along the way is really quite simple, whether it's painful to resolve, or, in other words, it's something we'd rather not be doing. It's manual work, so it's prone to human error. It's repetitive in the sense that the same tasks keep coming up again and again. Very often, and especially in particular for us, it's often that this is work that's come up as a result of a request from another team or has impacts on another team. And there's often a risk associated with missing a deadline. So these are things that need to happen right away or need to happen by a certain date, and for that reason they're interruptive. A common example might be certificate expiry and rotation. We've spent, by now Google's SRE book is probably quite well known, and we've spent a bit of time on our team looking through it, discussing it, and trying to understand how it applies to us. And the Google SRE book in particular spends some time talking about toil, and they give us a nice, clear set of criteria that we might be able to use to more specifically identify toil and more systematically identify toil as it occurs. And so they bring up things like repetitiveness. A key point that they make that may not be the most obvious thing is that toil provides no enduring value. So these are tasks that you start and you finish it, and by the time you finish it, you haven't made any lasting improvement to your system. Your team's not better off. Adding a user account is great for the new user, but overall, you're not in a much better place. It's manual, and because the decision-making process is pretty simple, it's probably automatable. The SRE book also introduces this notion of tactical work, and that toil is quite often tactical. And what they mean by that is it tends to be reactive. You're reacting to a request, you're reacting to some event. This is not stuff that you've planned, and it's not the work that you really want to be working on. And toil, as your system grows or as your teams grow, it tends to grow along with that. It might be also worth, so these are the things that can help you determine what is toil. It's worth spending some time thinking about what sorts of things might seem like toil but actually are not. And Again, this is another topic that the SRE book spends some time discussing. They use this label of overhead to cover some of the types of tasks that you might be likely to feel are toil, but in their opinion are probably not. These are things like administrative chores, team meetings. For us, incident reporting, so the follow-up from an incident, providing feedback to component teams if their component was involved. It might feel to us in the moment as toil. Like it may feel like something we'd rather not be doing, but incident reporting is something that for us provides lasting value and down the road can prevent similar incidents from recurring. And so for that reason, it doesn't really meet the condition of not providing lasting value and is probably not toil. There are other things that they call it grungy work. These are things like cleanup, hygiene, decluttering. They're not fun, but they also can leave you in a much better place. And it probably hardly needs to be said that engineering work itself is not toil. This is the reason you're there. It's novel, it requires your judgment, encompasses things like automation scripts or the activity that you take on to reduce your toil. And systems engineering. In particular, there might be manual tasks like manual configuration changes to your production environment, which may seem like toil because of the manual nature. And they may be automatable. But if they're making a lasting improvement to your system, they may not, in fact, be toil. So now we know a bit about what toil is, and maybe what it isn't, and why does it matter? What if we just leave it alone? Well, one thing we know is that toil will tend to increase left alone. And it's not something that you want to have too much of around. It can have negative impacts on your team members. It can have negative impacts on your team as a whole. For individuals on your teams, it can have a negative impact on morale. Constantly doing work that isn't that satisfying. It can have implications for career advancement. If you're stuck doing simple, menial tasks that you'd rather not be doing, you're not really getting exposed to new information, you're not growing. And because it's reactive and interrupts your team's prioritized work, it's going to slow you down. That's a negative impact on your entire team, your project. That said, many of these things are unavoidable. So they're not just going to go away, and we need to find a way to start chipping away at the toil that exists. Now that we know what toil is, we can start to use the criteria that we know about to really nail down what is toil, the toil in our midst. So as we're working day to day, we can start asking ourselves, as tasks come up, does this fit the criteria for toil? Is this reacting to some event? Is this a request from an external team that keeps on coming up? If it was a page, if you were paged, was this a page that indicated an issue that really needed immediate attention? Or is this one of those pages that comes up and you mute and you deal with in the morning? Was there a definite action attached to it? And if there was, might that action be automatable? One thing to pay close attention to is what your new team members, if you have any, if there's anyone new on your team, what are they noticing? What are they saying? Gather feedback from them. People who haven't been around a long time tend to see things that we may have gotten used to, that they may see toil that we've become numb to. And if there's one practice that we're trying to do more and more of, and that is inter-team rotations, an exchange from one team to another. It keeps communication channels open, it builds empathy, and it keeps a fresh perspective on what's working, what's not working on your team. One thing that's easy to track, and one of the most simple and easy things to track and useful things is recurrence, just the simple recurrence of common toilsome tasks. One of our other operations, SRE teams at Pivotal has come up with this tool that they use, technique that they use. They call it a Toil Snake. Caution against Googling Toil Snake unless you're really interested in plumbing. All it is as a type of toil comes up, say onboarding a user, they'll put a sticky on this left column here with a label indicating what kind of toil it is. And every time someone on the team encounters that, they'll put another sticky to the right of it, indicating when it happened, how long they spent. And every time it comes up, you put a new sticky beside it. And these lines grow and grow until you get this picture telling you what toil you tend to be spending your time on. And that gets to be really helpful when it comes time to figure out when you want to address your toil, what should you start with? Because you're not going to get it all squashed at once. Another fairly useful tool is the ubiquitous 2x2. As you start to wonder about how you should prioritize your strategy for burning down some of your toil. And for a bit more on that side of things, I'm going to hand off to Bozhidar here.
Thank you very much, Jesse. The 2x2, now that Jesse has talked about defining, identifying toil, let's talk a little bit about prioritizing and filtering for toil. The 2x2 is a very useful tool for prioritizing, and we'll look at some examples of how we can use it later. As you see in the diagram, you have two axes, and the properties, the values on the axes might vary depending on your team. In general, impact and frequency are very good defaults because a lot of other things tend to relate to them. Other possibilities might be how difficult is the item to fix, how long does it take to fix, any security concerns, or severity to customers. Before we get into prioritizing toil, let's briefly look at filtering for toil. Many of you might recognize this old XKCD diagram, which is very useful now as it was then. It looks at the impact of various items over 5 years. So it takes into consideration how many times do they happen per day, the frequency, and how much time is required in resolving those items. And it really helps you understand if the toilsome task is worth fixing, because some toil won't be worth optimizing for, at least right now. To recap a slide that Jesse presented, these are some of the areas and items impacted by toil. And we might need to consider who is the toil impacting. If we try to consider all the parties involved, the team you're on might be at the center. That might be your most pressing priority. You might want to consider other teams in the organization. And we've used the term R&D because we're engineers ourselves, but it could apply to business teams or any teams in the organization. You look at the organization as a whole and potentially customers, community, and society in general. If we combine both of these together, you have this combination of things to consider about toil. We get a sense of the overall impact. A lot of consideration might go into money and time because that might be missed business opportunities, regulatory or reputation impacts for the business. The reputation part comes into effect for impact on the software community and greater society as a whole, because that's how they view your company. Often this is a good thought exercise, but it could be really useful when you try to get support from your organization about solving the toil. If something takes a really long time to automate, to solve, you might need to make a good case about how much money, how much time it's costing the whole organization. So if we return to the 2x2, and you might be asking yourself, how do I arrange some of the items that I've identified as toil in this tool? As a team, you will start discussing and aligning the stickies, the items that you've identified against one axis. And after some more discussion, you will align them against the other axis. And there's usually a few quadrants that are the most impactful. In this case, the top right, the high impact, high frequency. I won't go into too much detail about the examples shown in this diagram, but some examples might be around support. Your team might be tasked with management for user and client accounts, permissions around those accounts. As Jesse mentioned, incident handling and reporting. Not all of it could be considered toil, but for example, bringing responders up to speed, making sure they have a centralized document they can access, having a repeatable and well-documented process that the team can follow in the case of an emergency in production. Timeline generation is a big thing, which might take up a considerable amount of time, as well as scheduling, feedback, retrospectives, or any other meetings that need to happen after an incident. On a similar tangent, there might be deployment reports that you do, documentation that you share with the rest of your organization and other teams about updates you're doing to your service, your platform. And they might take a long time if you have to do root cause analysis if something unexpected happens. There's also detecting and deterring abuse, which we'll get into in a few slides, and support for any services your team provides, such as a shared CI/CD system, any credentials that are integrated with it that others might not have access to, and so on. If we look at a couple of examples that our team has faced and how we automated it, you can get a sense of, what's next. Now that your team has prioritized this toil, how can you go about solving it? In our case, the two examples that come to mind are detecting and deterring abusive workloads on our platform and support requests. We didn't solve all of them in one go, in one story. For abusive workloads, for example, our first pass was detection and notification. And notification could mean many things. Sometimes it might be you get an email, you might get a Slack instant messaging notification, or you might get a page if it's something really serious like denial of service using resources on a public cloud because you don't want your account to go in a bad state. Our second iteration, we noticed we didn't really enjoy creating stories and adding details. Oftentimes, the information provided by the detection was enough for the content of the story. So that was automated, and our engineers on our team could just focus on starting and working on the story. And lastly, automatic suspension. Now, this is a little more involved, and we haven't implemented it yet because many different factors go into deciding when to do this. In our case, abusive workloads dropped down in frequency, and we still wanted to manually confirm that we were detecting everything correctly. For the second example, support requests can mean many things. In our team's case, it might be account management, it might be access to services we provide, shared resources. And our first pass at this was acknowledging the support and asking any clarification questions. A lot of our support requests arrive via Slack or in person. So if it comes via Slack, we have instructions how users can tag an interrupt bot, which acknowledges the request and asks clarifications about the severity of the support request. How soon do you need this resolved? Iteration 2 might be story creation, similar to the abusive workloads. And later on, you might automate follow-up and gather feedback on the level of support they received, how satisfied the end users were. And down the road, self-service. This really depends on the type of system you're automating this, or the type of process you're automating this for, but this might be the most involved one, and we're not there yet. So now that we've talked about defining, identifying, filtering, prioritizing toil, let's jump into What's next? Let's say you've started to hone your SRE skills. You've adopted SLIs, representing your customer's experience, SLOs, representing your customer's expectations. You've begun figuring out how to minimize toil, how to automate it. What next? If we begin with a quote by Patricia Johnson, who is a product marketing manager at the Pivotal Austin office, she said that culture is the leading indicator of DevOps performance. Before we go any further, we'd like to thank Daniel Story, whose artwork we're displaying here. He graciously allowed us to modify it for the content in these slides. And also a shout out to our team member, Corey Innes, who's in our San Francisco office for some of the content and adaptations to the artwork. So back to Act 3. If we keep in mind that this is really all about culture, that is, if DevOps introduces the practices, cultural changes in principle, how do we make this scale? In this slide, you'll see there's a slight modification. We've got the SRE wrecking ball, which breaks down barriers between teams. So if DevOps is fundamentally about cultural improvement in principle, you might think about site reliability engineering about cultural improvement in practice. We suggest that the team best positioned to spread these practices is the engineers in your company, because they get to experience those practices, the tools, and they think about them the most, perhaps. If we consider an engineer on that team, for example, here we are, the platform team. We figured out some of these techniques, tools to help us with toil, incidents, reliability of our service and platform. What do we do next? Well, we go tell our friends about that, chat with the other component teams in your company who might also be experiencing some of that toil and the same problems you are facing. Those might be services teams or application developers, and they often have to deal with reliability, with incidents, and so on. And now that we've talked to these teams, we also encourage them to talk to other teams that they interact with. And with that, the practice, the techniques, the tools can go viral within the company. You might be asking yourself, why should I be doing this? Well, as we mentioned before, engineers, operators of the platform, they're at the center of it all. They experience the toil, the pain, and they use the techniques and tools on almost a daily basis. Effectively, you're a hub for collaboration, and the services teams, the developers that interact with you, you can really enable them to use these practices as well. Well, what if your organizational structure doesn't support this? Again, why me? If we look at this diagram, a lot of organizations might relate to this command and control model. In this scenario, directives, if we can call them that, get issued from up high, from leadership, and they're passed down through some hierarchy. So often, middle management comes up with the strategy of how to execute on the vision. And the staff, the engineers, PMs, they focus on the execution and implementing that vision in practice. So once again, as engineers, it is you who figured out how to adopt these reliability practices, handle and minimize incidents, and burn down toil. So it is you, we argue, who are best positioned to spread those practices. And that is to say, cultural change comes from the bottom up. And that is why you. So to conclude our tale, to reiterate, if DevOps is about the principles of cultural change, and SRE is about the practices that lead to cultural change, if you want to summarize, you can say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, this is a quote by Peter Drucker, who has been called the man who invented management. Another quote which stuck with me and is really powerful comes from Joe Tai, who was a consultant providing training on values, leadership, building a culture of ownership and personal motivation for companies. And he said that the company's bottom line for next year might be impacted by the current strategies. but the bottom line for the following years might be more influenced by the current culture. So again, we stress that culture should come from the bottom up, and it's a very powerful thing. You might be asking yourself, what are some practices? How can I get started with this for my team and organization? A few of the things that we try to practice in our team and at Pivotal: balanced teams. We want leadership to be represented and be a part of your team, if not on a daily basis, at least once or twice weekly. That way they can hear firsthand accounts about some of the pain, toil, blocks that the team is experiencing. We try to have regularly scheduled team retrospectives, tech retrospectives about the tools and practices we use, as well as team health assessments. And those are at different intervals and they have different purposes, but they allow your team not to burn out and in a collaborative environment to discuss some of these items. As Jesse mentioned, rotations of individuals between teams are really useful and they're beneficial for teams on both sides. Be sure to have experience reports and at least feedback from the people when their rotations finish. That way you can evolve the practice and have a better time next time. Two of the last items that we have on the slide: product working groups. They're really useful for standardizing practices in your company, and those might even evolve into material that could be shared with customers. And SLI, SLO workshops. That's something that our colleague Corey Innes has been doing for quite a while with internal teams in our organization. They help establish a sustainable team practice and help that other team with monitoring the service that they provide. We've also tried this on ourselves recently for our support work, and we've developed SLIs and SLOs, which we currently monitor. So with all of that in mind, we come to the end of our presentation. Here are some references and resources about the material that we used. And on the next slide is our contact information. A bit of a disclaimer: we might not be here the whole day because we forgot about some non-toilsome work that we have to attend today, but we'll stick around on the side if you have any pressing questions. I think we've also got a couple of minutes left, so we might have time for a few questions now, but please do reach out with any further questions you have. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.